Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for tuning in to today's panel. Today we're going to be talking about coaches' mental health, athlete well-being, and team environment. And the goal today is to examine the role of mental health in coaching by talking about the stressors that are on the coaches specifically and the strategies that we can give coaches to support their own well-being, and talk about the impact of that coaches have on athletes' mental health and the overall team culture. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Brigitte Shulze, and I am the co-founder of the Sarah Shulze Foundation. It's a foundation that our family started after the death of our daughter, Sarah Shulze, who died by suicide in April of 2022. She was a cross country and track and field runner at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And after her death, we started this foundation to bring awareness to mental health and mental well-being, suicide prevention, and advocacy for student athletes. So now let's meet our panel.
My name is Andy McPherson. I'm an associate athletic trainer at the University of Richmond with men's basketball. I grew up playing soccer and baseball my whole life, and I was fortunate to earn a football scholarship, and I played football at Arkansas State University as a kicker, so I understand the time and the demands. But I've been an athletic trainer for 20 years, and I've dealt with healthcare of athletes at many levels, with physical, with mental, with spiritual, with psychological, but ultimately it's all about the student athlete.
Great. Thank you, Andy.
Mhm.
Alyssa?
Yeah, hi. My name is Alyssa Nigaman. I went to the University of Wisconsin, ran track and field and cross country, and was a former teammate of Sarah Shulze. My background growing up, I played every sport. I did figure skating, I did ski jumping, I did cross country skiing, gymnastics, ballet. I did all of it. And then I ended up falling in love with running, where I ran at the University of Wisconsin for 6 years. And now I'm coaching at Niwot High School, and I absolutely love it.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Tim?
My name's Tim Fairbanks. I'm a clinical social worker with Sagent Behavioral Health. I am located in Iowa City, Iowa. Growing up, all the sports, soccer, baseball, wrestling, track and field, you name it, golf, we did it all. I ended up collegiately running track and field and cross country, was middle distance runner. Have been in the mental health field for 15, almost 16 years and done a little bit of everything, but like the rest of us, sports kind of calls us back, and have spent the last, 7 to 10 years really working with athletes in the clinical setting, in the collegiate setting, in the community setting.
Great. Thank you, guys. Let's talk about specifically the coach's mental health right now. And what are some of the most common challenges that coaches face, and what tends to drive those challenges?
Tim, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was going to say, let me jump in. So there was actually an article published in the British Journal of Medicine in late 2025, and they were collecting survey data on these Olympic and Paralympic coaches, right? And they are looking sort of for what are the biggest barriers for those coaches at this like really elite level to accessing mental health for themselves. That was like the premise of the whole study. So their end wasn't huge. I think it was like 70, but that's still a lot of Olympic coaches by the time you get to that level. So number one, their biggest factor was, just the stigma around it and the pressure to win. So Alyssa, you touched it when you said that moment to pause. It's the go, 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 go. I don't even have time to sit and be introspective, right? And at the clinical side, that's, what we do in the therapy room, right? That's how we, one, recognize that there's some kind of mental health issue happening, and two, how we start to change those things for those coaches. You have to have a moment to like breathe and be sort of introspective. And then, there was some other big factors, but the fourth one really kind of stood out to me, and they ranked them sort of 1 through 10, but number 4 was just sort of mentality around the vocabulary being scary, right? So coaches didn't access mental health care because they didn't understand what some kind of a diagnosis like a major depressive disorder or a generalized anxiety disorder or a bipolar disorder, like they don't know what those things are. And since they are in a position with their athletes particularly, and then their athletic departments, of they should know things because they're directing the situation, right? Like, who wants to be the guy that doesn't know the answer when you show up? Not the head coach of anything, right? And so that one really stood out to me, that like the lack of vocabulary knowledge was something that they said was a limiting factor to these really elite level coaches accessing mental health care for themselves and then allowing for their athletes to do it as well.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point, which, coaches don't have any certification to become a coach, right? Like, Andy, you've got the letters after your name, and Tim, you have the letters after your name for your advanced degrees.
Yeah.
But coaches, they're usually just former athletes. And so, yeah, they don't know a lot about the clinical terms that, Tim, you were just talking about. And in other countries, there is more certification of coaches at the elite level. So I guess that brings me to my next question, which is, so who's responsible for helping the coach to learn these things? Is it the institution or the club that hires them? Is it their own responsibility? And do we need a certification in place for coaches in the future to help them with these more advanced parts of coaching?
I would say yes, there does need to be more certification. I'll like with the high school process, when I was hired at NIWAT, there's a whole bunch of different I don't even know, training things that I had to do because you're attached to the school. But if I was a club coach, I technically don't need any certifications. I think you might need safe sport with USA track and field, but that's it. Which is, to me, when I was coaching specifically at the youth level, was mind-boggling. I was like, are you sure I don't need to do more? Like, we're working with really young kids and making a safe environment and and I think a lot of youth coaches do feel, I don't know if there is research on it, or at least like the community that I was in talking to other youth coaches, where it's just like, you generally have, again, like athlete experience, but like outside of that, like this might be your first time coaching at the youth level and you just do it and you like volunteer and you enjoy it. But I would definitely say at like an institution, especially at the collegiate level, it does fall on administration, I'd say, to make sure like coaches get that proper training. But as someone who I personally, I love taking extreme ownership. Like I also, in my own, growth and experience in this sport, I do want to have an interest in making sure I always trying to get better, always trying to learn more, always trying to evolve. And so like trying to, do these trainings, I think is really important to want to do on an individual level as well.
Yeah. And I would just guess, Alyssa, your training was probably concussion oriented, maybe sexual harassment and something like that. Did you have any mental health training through the high school, through your training?
No mental health training, but we did have like mandatory reporting and like you like search for key factors and stuff. And sometimes there is like mental health involved with that, but
Yeah.
no, nothing mental health specific at all.
Yeah. Andy, can you talk about at your time in your different colleges that you've been a part of, what kind of training has been available to coaches and what have you seen work and not work?
Yeah, a lot of it is, not required when it comes to like mental health. Recently, in the past 5 years, we've been pushing for a mental health first aid class, and it is offered on campus and it is offered to our coaches. Um, but sometimes those coaches see that as another thing that I've got to check off. They don't really, possess like the ownership to, oh, well, I want to learn more about it and whatnot. So some of those classes and courses are available, but they're not taken advantage of. That's how it is. And I wish that there was more, like you talked about, like maybe some more mentorship to where, I have a couple people that I bounce questions off of, and maybe there's as this grow, hopefully it grows to where some of those mentors are publishing, like talking to their peers about, hey, do this mental health first aid class, or some type of um, certification or just course that you're just not clicking through. Because I know probably like all of us, we have to take some type of like IT security module every, once a year. Is like, is there a bigger corporation, a bigger group that can come up with some kind of mental health module that becomes mandatory for high schools and colleges? As they do that with police officers and firefighters, how can that spread to coaches? I think that is a good place to start, just to, become familiar, like you talked about, like the stigma and the unknown vocabulary. Just become familiar with it as much as we talk about concussions and heat illness and anemia and cancer and heart attacks. Why can't we talk about mental health?
Yeah. And do you think that um, to get the coaches on board with doing something like mental health first aid, which I think is, what we would probably say is the benchmark of mental health training. Do you think that it needs to be mandated by the NCAA? Does it need to be mandated by state government? I mean, we are seeing laws passed throughout the country, slowly and surely, that is mandating mental health first aid training, certainly for colleges and some high schools. But I just was curious to hear what you guys think.
I think it's a valid question. I would love for it to come from the NCAA.
Yeah.
But the NCAA is very tied up in a lot of different things right now.
Yeah.
And even at the conference level, like the Atlantic 10 that we're in, or even the SEC or the ACC, a lot of these, they have medical boards, and I would assume the athletic trainers, take, the mental health first aid. But I also think, the athletic trainers, they see those athletes every day, but even higher to where some of the coaches can take it, just to be recognized with the terms and understand that a little bit more. That'd be very beneficial, not only for their student athletes, but for themselves. Because that's really, the athletes look up to the coaches, and the coaches have to take care of themselves because, there are constraints.
Right. It is a modeling relationship,
Correct.
right? Like
Correct.
that's, yeah. I mean, let's talk about some of the specific pressures that maybe coaches go through that are underestimated by, people that are not in the athletics. What pressures are people under?
I think the coaches often, at the high level. So I'm a sports fan. I love to watch, March Madness, college football, all of those things. There was a piece during the college football playoff here, kind of ending 2025, coming into 2026, about a special teams coach that had been at Georgia, and then there was, some substance use issues following injury, and like nobody essentially knew that this was happening, right? Like this guy was abusing narcotics to a point where it was destabilizing his home life. And he ended up in what was residential treatment for substance use disorder. And like, he's at a major Power 5 program, and nobody recognized that until he came forward and said, this is the thing that I need to do. And ESPN did like a beautiful piece on him. It was, a 45-minute little deal that they ran multiple different times. But they're facing different pressures, right? So like, I see them as a fan, I forget that they're married and they got to go home to their partner, that they got to change that hat and be mom or dad when they get home. They got kids. You're on the road, at the high level, you're on the road, you travel constantly. I sat with an athlete that I worked with here who just finished his professional career in the NFL. And, he thought one city was kind of home, and he had bought a home and he'd settled, and the kids are in the school district, and then he got traded, and he spent 20 weeks halfway across the country living in a hotel room while he misses his kid. And there's a lot of stress in that, and the coaches are facing the same thing, right? At the high level, administration change can rapidly change your job and those kind of things. So there's that stress pressure to win. But even just on like the human level, how I can say here in Iowa City, it's a community, but it's a city. But like our head football coach here, he can't go to dinner without somebody stopping him to ask for a picture, right? Or just have a meal with his family, like, which creates a level of anxiety that is not the normal for the average day person or even the fan. And those are things that like we don't think about. Plus, give them a gold star because they're also carrying the weight to some level of all of their athletes and all of their coaching staff that they hired, and they're responsible for their jobs. And there's like this long sequencing, and that trickles all the way down to like young youth kids sports. Like I have some patients that I work with here who coach like you said, Alyssa, just sort of entering that sphere at the coaching level, and they're coaching youth and they're volunteering. But now their neighbor is mad because their kid isn't getting enough playing time, and their kids have to go to school together, and it causes pressure in this social circle. And then they come into my office and they're like, how do I juggle helping these kids enjoy this sport and my neighbor being mad at me, get this KPI that Andy mentioned? Like, because that's really what it's coming to. The coaches it's literally coming from every direction at a coach, way more than we give them credit for.
And let's talk about the pressure that, specifically in the college world, but even in high school, like even with Alyssa at a high performing sports school like NIWAT, what pressures about their performance and their winning record and how that affects their job insecurity? How does that all compound right onto a coach's mental health?
What was funny when I first started at NIWAT, I was initially brought in because it was kind of a down year for the girls. And so I was supposed to help with like the team culture piece. And so like helping them get back to NXN, because it's never a given, but we knew it was going to be a long and hard road to get back. Because they lost a really, great senior class and great leadership.
We're talking about Nike cross country nationals.
Yeah, Nike cross nationals. Yeah, sorry. I'm like in such a little bubble that I forget.
Okay.
But anyways, when I initially got brought on, and like kind of seeing everything, and obviously they like operated at a really high level, it was like kind of hard because it's like I knew my job wasn't dependent on if I'd be able to keep it based on this, because it is the high school level and our head coach is really understanding. But like that thought in the back of your mind is like, I'm trying to connect with these girls, and like they're high school girls, like they put up a little bit of a front, like, and it can be hard to get to know them. And we didn't end up making it. And so as a coach, I felt like I failed them, but I also had to like kind of take a step back and give myself grace. And it's like, I did everything I could in my power. And like and I set them up for success. Like our program set them up for success. And I won't get into the details about that, but I will say when I initially was brought in, like I I was a little apprehensive, I guess, and like didn't really acknowledge that pressure when I first got there. But thankfully afterwards, I like kind of took some time and was like, all right, I can't do everything for the kids. And like, parents have to realize that too. Our coaching staff has to realize that, because sometimes when you're the only female coach on the staff, you get the female problems. And sometimes you get the pressure of, I had to figure out how to, like making sure they're getting their periods and like they're eating enough and addressing all of these things in like these little windows of time that I was able to when I had never done it before.
Yeah.
So that's like a very unique, I think, point of pressure. But yeah, you guys can also speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about like responsibility. I feel like our coaches have a heavy burden of responsibility to many different people. The responsibility to win, and even the responsibility of running a clean program and making sure people are staying out of trouble and trying to graduate from high school or college. Those things are what's just as important across all the country. And so I think there's a lot of people who have different opinions with like, parents. I think my daughter's the greatest soccer player there is. But unfortunately there's 28 other girls on the team that have the same parents as I do. So the coach gets it from the parents, and then how do you disseminate that to the kids, and then how do you go home and realize that I've got to, shovel the snow off the driveway, and I've got to help with laundry, and I've got to do all the things that I'm supposed to do as a husband and a wife, and all my daily duties per se at home, just as much as the responsibilities at work. So again, just from both avenues of trying to be, a good coach and to be a good parent and to be a good spouse, all of those just continue to compile to where, again, it just shows the importance of mental health and trying to identify and make sure that you're taking care of yourself.
So I mean, I think we've all talked about, all of these pressures and all of these stresses and trying to identify everything that is on the coach's plate. Let's maybe do a little segue to talk about how the coach takes all of these things that we've just been talking about, and then how does that affect their team and the athletes. So let's talk about, how can the coach's stress influence athlete confidence or anxiety or motivation? Like everything we've talked about, that's a whole lot. Now, how is it going to show up with the athlete?
I mean, from a clinical perspective, just take something like a generalized anxiety disorder, right? So you get some of the symptoms are you are more fatigued easily, you can be restless, you can have hypermotor where you talk really fast, or you can have motor retardation where you talk really slow. Okay, so what does that look like when it's a coach to an athlete? Now I'm way shorter tempered, and I don't even recognize it, that I talk louder or faster than I want to. My body language becomes very different from being open to discussing something with my athlete to you're in trouble, or even if that's unintentional, because the mental health is like operating in the background, right? It's on this coach who is having some kind of issue with just something very simple, common, like a generalized anxiety disorder, can show up in that day-to-day interaction with the athlete, and it feels pretty common, but then it moves to this other, like that's when it's anxiety, that's when it's disordered anxiety, right? Like we got a lot of pressure to win, and I've been an athlete. I take feedback pretty well. Like if you want to holler at me across the track, do this better, or in the wrestling room, take that feedback. There's a difference between that and when it moves to disordered and it becomes more, and that's the clinical side of how it shows up in coach to athlete relationship.
Yeah. And I think it's important to also recognize, these coaches, we're mostly talking about youth through college. those age of athletes, their brains aren't fully developed. They're not completely functioning as a fully developed adult. Even though in college, they're over 18. So our society, the university, everybody says, no, you're an adult. And I think that is something that gets lost a lot in translation. And again, maybe it needs to go back into that certification or education of coaches to recognize, who you are actually dealing with. Where do coaches sometimes underestimate their impact on athlete mental health?
I think where coaches underestimate is, I think sometimes in that, those short-term goals, the short-term or the short-term results, where it's a win at all costs environment. And I experienced a little bit of that at Wisconsin with one of my former coaches there. And I think when that becomes the forefront, and when a coach also is like stressed about their keeping their job, because your accolades, your performance, and how these 18-year-olds are performing is how you keep your job, essentially at the collegiate level. And I think sometimes when you lose sight of who an athlete is, which is a person, and you look at them as your KPIs, I think is what you referred to it. I don't even that's a term I'm not super familiar with.
Wins and losses.
Wins and losses. I think when that starts to become your forefront and you're just trying to just manage these young kids that are just like they're still developing, they're still growing, they're still trying to figure out their place in the world and their identity, and you're putting this, your pressure and anxieties onto them and not realizing that, I think that takes a huge toll, because kids are like sponges, they absorb. And so I think for me, at least, like I try to be hyper vigilant with how I communicate. And like I process my emotions with the athletes that I coach. And so like sometimes when I'm frazzled, it can come off as mad. And so trying to manage that and being like, hey, I'm not mad at you, but this is the expectation. Like we need to make sure we're holding and being aware that we're trying to do. And like, I'm going to give you grace and like, we're okay. And like, we'll move on from that. I might have got sidetracked a little bit, but I think that answered your question.
Yeah.
I think coaches underestimate mental health and the capacities of what these student athletes are dealing with, whether in the high school or the college or even Pee Wee, about like they're growing, they're learning. They got stresses at school, they got stresses at home, and even trying to accomplish good things on the court or the field. Even especially when it comes to like encouragement. If a coach is, there's a mistake and a coach is trying to make a correction, is it positive or is it negative reinforcement? So a lot of those kind of, what is communicated versus what is perceived, I think is where a lot of it can go south. And I think even coaches underestimate mental health with, when they're in the heat of the battle, when it's in games or at practices or at the end when they've just been going the whole day at practice and it's the last second shot of the game and somebody makes a mistake. And that just, when we're all have a lot of stress going on, if it's the end of the season as opposed to the beginning of the season, you're in a tournament where you've been playing for 3 days in a row. When we're all have our energy banks low and our filters kind of fizzle at that point. So I think that's when we all become vulnerable about other things, and we kind of tend to not think about other people as opposed to the way that I experience mental health.
And, in high school, I feel like, coaches are maybe more supervised because we are talking about under 18 kids. So you do have a level of oversight on coaches. as we get to college and even professional, whose responsibility is it to oversee the coach's day-to-day interactions with their athletes? And Andy, I kind of direct this one to you because I feel like athletic trainers are sort of that unofficial go-between of athlete and coach, but is it their role to also supervise?
I would not say to supervise because everybody looks at a head coach as the leader of the program, the forefront, the figurehead, and even to the fact that sometimes the coach has more power or more influence than the administrator that supervises them. So that's where it just becomes tricky. As my role as an athletic trainer, I feel like many athletic trainers see it as athletic trainers are advocates for each student athlete that we're taking care of. I'm blessed because I work with 16 guys. So I see them day in and day out, but even at Division II and Division III, those athlete numbers are a lot higher to where athletic trainers are covering, 2, 3, or 4 sports in a semester. So they don't get the best connection as they do, as luckily as I do. But yes, like if I go upstairs and I talk to my coaches, I'm gonna be like, hey, well, so and so has an ankle sprain, this, and oh, by the way, a player is having problems with, their girlfriend or their boyfriend or mom and dad or kind of bringing them the riot act and whatnot, or we've got situations to where professors will have 3 tests in one day, and that takes a toll mentally on the student athlete. And I think, we're not discussing rumors, but we're just, bringing up the red flags of, hey, just to let you know, maybe they can, reach out to the players and develop conversations and have those relationships to where, it's going to work out.
Yeah.
But the responsibility of supervision is, ultimately we're all called by ourselves to, to take care of ourselves. And rather that sometimes I need a nudge from my wife every once in a while, like, hey, you need to do this. And you're like, yep, you're right. And sometimes it's, my coworker, like, hey, well, you really need to go to that. And I'm like, we all answer to each other. We're all our brother's keeper per se.
Yeah. And then I want to ask this question to all of you, based on your own experience as athletes, but also, even as parents of young athletes, like what does psychological safety look like in a team, and how much of that is shaped by the coach?
I would say psychological safety on a team is when you are able to empower your athletes to speak and they are heard. And I think it takes a lot of work to get to that point. But like I'm really lucky with where I'm at NIWA. And so the relationships I've developed with my girls, like they'll come up to me and they'll tell me whatever is on their mind for better or for worse. And I'll, just try and meet them in that moment because like they know I don't judge. Or at least I mean, I don't. They can tell me whatever. They tell me their boyfriend problems, if there's any issues within the team. And so I think it's just like it's something that you have to be vigilant and you have to make sure you're always like you're where your feet are with them. And you go through it with them. And I think understanding too, it's like I have to remind, I was in high school once. Like I might not have experienced what you're experiencing right now, but like we're gonna get through it together. And so yeah, you guys can also speak to this, but that's what I have to say.
Coach, I think your athletes are pretty lucky. You clinically have done a couple of things. I'll jump back to like 2 statements ago. Bridget, you'd asked about like how does the coach's mental health show up in like impacting their athlete? And I gave you some anxiety stuff, but like when Alyssa was talking, she said, I can get frazzled and that shows up as anger, but then I come back to like talk to my athlete and we like resolve that, right? So in clinical terms, that's like a repair, right? So if we're working in systems theory or like couples therapy or anywhere where there's this interactive level of therapy, like what you just described is like gold standard of how you're going to create that culture for your athlete. Right? Your athletes are light years ahead of where, 20 years ago, where it was as when I was a college athlete. Some of those things, like you're doing that and you don't even know it, and I'm sitting here listening to you as a professional going, wow, that's already like ingrained in her. She's repairing that relationship and she's making it a priority. And like that shows up. And then I hear Andy talking about, oh, ultimately there is some responsibility to yourself to like look at what am I doing and ask the people that I trust the most, whether that's my wife or my, colleagues that I really like. Your athletes are going to be are in great hands. Like on the clinical side, you see those things showing up. But you're come back to your question. You asked about like what does it look like for me as a dad when my kids are playing sport? Like how do I know if their team is healthy? Um, I gauge it. So I have an 11-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son, and they're both at varying levels. My daughter's a little more competitive than my son. He's like, I'm doing these things for fun. Uh, so some days for him, it's good team culture if he's laughing and joking with the kids on the pool deck and that they're messing around and that I see that they're like messing around because that's like on par, right? He's just not very serious about it. He's just like living his day-to-day life. And then my daughter, who does equestrian work and is part of this drill team where they take their horses and they move them around and they do all these very intricate things. If she's not smiling, if she's not ready to go when I get home, if I have to say, hey, it's time to go, I'm going to start looking at things because that was a thing that, she goes to it because she's passionate about it and she loves it and it's been her thing. And now I'm seeing maybe she's not as passionate or excited about it. And so it doesn't mean that that's happening, but that's my big red flag as dad of like, what's going on? How do I check in with my daughter? How do I ask coaches questions in opening ways? How do I start paying a little more attention? Those are the big red things for me as just like in the dad world, right? And I think those hold true in my clinical experience as well across like, you know, Power Four division, Division One athletes, all the way into the guys that I have worked with who have been in the NFL, right? Like when that's not the thing, when they're not excited to go to the complex, now it's a job instead of a man, I get to do this thing, right? And that's the big marker for me in that team thing is when it's not exciting anymore. Wow, that's a huge one.
Yes, I think this is a very important question is what does psychological safety of a team look like? Wow, because there's so many things that have different variables, but as I sit here and I wrote down a couple things like I think it's a some type of healthy balance to being challenged as an athlete and learning how to overcome adversity, but at the same time celebrating the success. Ultimately, it's going to be the coach and student athlete relationships. Knowing how each personality on the team is different. Each person is different, and how each person takes criticism is different. If you got in my face and yelled at me, come on, you got to do better, I'm going to respond. I'm like, yes, give it to me. I got it. Some people, when you get in their face and tell them you got to do better, they're going to shut down. Some people are going to wilt and some people are not. So as a coach, it's like you have to find what motivates each player to make sure that they can perform at the highest level. And then that's when the emotions get into it of a coach of like, trying to treat each individual the same, and that gets tricky sometimes. But it's, I think it's just having healthy relationships and also having those relationships where they're being the support system. You don't have to be the best friends with a coach, but maybe there is a coach that you can go talk to. Maybe there's a support staff like an athletic trainer that you can talk to where you have a support staff, a safety net to air out everything because your coach every day is not going to be happy. You're not going to win. In athletics, you don't win every game unless you're Indiana football. There's things that you're going to have adversity, and the coach is going to respond, and as individuals and as players, we are called to challenge ourselves and to be a little bit better than what we were the day before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a fine line in coaching of being really tough and being too tough and maybe abusive.
Yes.
And I think, that's a lot of what we're trying to talk about and identify here. What warning signs tell you that a coach or a team is not coping well?
I think Tim hit it on the spot about just, when, my daughter, she just didn't have fun going to play softball anymore. So, at that point as a parent, you have to learn like, well, we're not just going to sign up for things and then quit. So there are things that are out there as the desire to play. There's not as much fun. You become, disassociated with some of the teammates, some more physical outbursts with teammates, some more, just berating of coaches to other coaches and talking bad. And I think those are some of the unhealthy parts of some warning signs of a coach. Also the things that go unnoticed is the unhealthy ways that coaches are coping with this stress, whether it be alcohol or drugs or, avoiding their family, always at the facility till 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. All those things I think are the flags that a coach should start to question themselves of, what is the purpose? What am I, I need to reevaluate. I need to look in the mirror.
I would also say to that as well is when a team isn't coping well. Oh shoot, I just totally lost my thought. Tim, do you want to chime in while I gather my thoughts?
I will echo what Andy said is, how do I recognize as someone around the team? How do I recognize that the team is not coping well and that the coach is struggling mentally? The dialogue changes between the coach and the players, right? Between the coach and the coaches. And if you're a professional and you're watching that, that's a big red flag, right? Because now it's gone from that fine line of I trust you enough to press me to where I want to go, to now I'm just taking it too far because I don't even recognize that we've gone too far, right? And it's a pretty fine line and it can get there fairly quickly, but I think it's that dialogue that Andy was talking about, and even that Alyssa brought up with her own athletes is, I can come back to them and talk to them and we can have that, or we can talk about anything, right? Like, you lose the ability to talk about the anything. That's a big red flag. When you stop talking about boyfriends with your athletes and you're just talking about running, okay, something is fundamentally changing in the coach athlete relationship. That's a mental health like red flag, right? That dialogue piece is enormous. I think professionally is how I would look at it.
Yeah. I remember my thought now. Is when it comes to that piece with like that, generally like teams are going to do well when they're happy. And so I think especially with this generation, like giving these kids autonomy, because when they come to practice, they're going to give you your all, and you're going to give them the autonomy of what they need to help support them, whether like you let them choose what they get to do first for that day, or like sometimes we let them choose like their own running routes, for example. But I would say as a coach, sometimes where I have to check myself is like there's this fear of what you can control, what I can and what I can't control. And for me, when that starts getting out of balance, it goes to this like place of like, I can't control this. What do I do? And then you kind of have to like kind of recheck back in. And I think there's a lot that I can control in my own sphere, and that's what I can do, and I can take care of myself. But if I'm coming to practice and I'm worried about controlling a kid, then I'm not fully there. I'm not there for them. Like, that's my own issue, and I got to check that at the door. And I think that's like a big coping way is when you look at a coach and how they control their athletes. I think that's like something that you can pretty easily like pick up on at practice for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all great points. I think, what about coaching the athlete that maybe isn't so forthcoming with information, and it's hard to see how their well-being, their mental well-being is doing. What advice would you give coaches in that scenario?
I'd say like, if the team culture is good and they have, people that they're connected to on the team, sometimes a teammate will come to me and speak on another teammate's behalf. And sometimes I'm like surprised, but sometimes like you can see it in a kid's body language.
Mhm.
And when like the head's down, they're not engaged with their teammates, they're not engaged with what they're doing. I think it's really important to check in and have a conversation with that kid. And sometimes it takes a couple of conversations. Like it might not just be one and done and like, oh, they say nothing's wrong. Sometimes it might take a couple times. Sometimes you got to go ask another coach to see if like they can figure out what's going on. And I think connection to that is some kids just don't know how to ask for help and how to ask for like what support they need. So it's like sometimes I have to backtrack of like, well, how can I help you in this? How can I support you in this? And sometimes they just don't know. And I think being persistent and always being present, I think, with them and just hearing them and listening to them is the best thing you can do.
Yeah. Your kids are lucky to have you as a coach, Alyssa. Okay, I want to close us up with one more question that I want all of you guys to weigh in on here. And that is, if a coach is watching this today and could change one thing at their next practice to improve their own well-being or their team environment, what would it be, or what should it be?
And see, you told us yesterday this was going to be the question, Bridget, as we got prepared. So I gave it some thought, like some actual thought. And I'm like a big pop culture nerd, so like I land at this like Ted Lasso, be curious about your athletes, right? Um, and then after you're curious, create curious as normal, as the norm in the locker room, on the bus, on the plane, in the practice, on the practice field. Notice, that curiosity allows you to notice everything in social work and clinical work. We talk about behavior as communication also. And so the body language, right? Something as small as like my athlete isn't as swaggy as they have been before, right? Just something really simple like that. Hey, what's that about? How come we've changed X? How was my girlfriend, my boyfriend, your mom? How just curiosity, and create that as the norm. And that creates the culture to say, here is an issue. I may not know exactly what it is. I don't know the words for it. We got a team of trainers. We got a team of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, mental health, whatever that looks like. And you have a group of people that are a team. Let's lean on them to like sort that out. So I'm going to land with Ted Lasso and be curious, and then create that curiosity as the normal in your locker room on your team.
I love the Ted Lasso reference. And now I think you need to patent the be curious sign, that's going to go over the doorway.
Yeah.
Like Believe was in Ted Lasso. Yeah. Andy, what would you tell a coach today?
Well, one thing, we're talking about quotes and whatnot. I try to read a lot about leadership and whatnot. One that's staring me in my face on my desk right now says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. One that I told to one of my, our radio guy today, that's like, we were talking about certain things, and I said, well, the best steel doesn't make the best ships and wood doesn't make the best ships. What makes the best ships? Relationships. Relationships are the best. Relationships win. And how do you develop those relationships? And I think just the simplicity of letting a guard down as a coach and say, hey, let's go grab lunch. Let's go grab dinner. Let's go grab ice cream. Let's go grab coffee. Something to the fact of like, it's out of the office, it's out of your gym, it's off the field. Things are toned down to where it's like, what's going on? How are you doing? How are you? And more of a, tell me about what's going on in as much as you can. And as you begin to talk, hopefully those, they'll let you in. So, but, I think that, relationships are key to any type of team and team chemistry. And that's what I think if a coach can do that is just invest in your players because, if they know that you're fighting for them, I think they'll fight harder.
Love that. Okay, so we have be curious, build relationships. Alyssa, it's on you.
Oh no.
Bring us home.
I'm also a huge Ted Lasso fan. But when I first started coaching, it's only been 3 years, but I realized the power in vulnerability, in being vulnerable with your athletes. And so that can look different for everyone, but it's like, I don't have to show up every day and be perfect, but I can show up every day and I can be myself. And that's going to be the most powerful thing, especially as a woman and working with young women. Like the power of being yourself and being you and owning it is like the most powerful thing a young woman can see. And that helped me create like such great relationships with our athletes. And so I would also add to that is if you're struggling, I guess, as a coach and struggling to get to know your athletes, the biggest thing you can do is care, because that's always, always, always going to show up. That's like what a kid is going to see first is how much you care. And the way that you care, I think, that's what I want kids to remember me for, is how much I cared about them as people, not as athletes, as people. So I would say that's, instead of going on, to not get into a whole TED talk, that's the things I will leave it at.
I love it. Caring, authenticity, relationships, and be curious. Like what great, simple, right? What seems simple, but very hard. For coaches to take all of that in and bring that into their team with all the other stuff that they have on their plate. But I think those are great things to work towards, right? Well, I want to thank you all so much for doing this panel and having open conversations about coaches' mental health and how that affects the team environment. And thank you guys all so much.